In January 1902, this soldier was one of 210 men sent by the Imperial Japanese Army to cross the Hakkoda Mountains in the middle of winter. The mission was a top-secret part of Japan's preparations for battles in cold, mountainous regions. What followed became the deadliest mountain disaster in all of recorded history. This is the story of the Hakkoda Mountain Disaster. At the turn of the 20th century, tensions between the Japanese emperor and the Russian Tsar were rising. Russia was strong and well accustomed to fighting in freezing conditions. Due to the cunning of the Russians, their attacks were often launched in the cold winter. This kept the Japanese army on constant high alert. For Japan, the prospect of war in such uncontrollable conditions was a genuine nightmare. If war began, Russian bombardments would focus on the northern coast of Honshu Island. Roads and railways would be destroyed, forcing Japanese forces to move through southern Honshu, where the towering, merciless Hakkoda mountain range stood. These mountains, over 1,500 meters high, had active volcanoes and snowstorms that could erase an entire army. So, the Japanese High Command came up with a plan, which was to prepare special units to secure a safe passage through the mountains during the winter. The plan seemed ideal for several reasons: training the soldiers to handle the harsh conditions, scouting the mountain route to avoid getting lost when war broke out, gathering important field intelligence for the rest of the army. Thus, two military teams were tasked with different missions. The first team was the 31st Regiment, whose mission was relatively simple: to march 21 miles from the city of Hirosaki to Aomori. The other team was the 5th Regiment. These two regiments were already stationed in northern Japan, and the soldiers were accustomed to enduring the harsh winters. The man tasked with leading this operation was Captain Bonkichi Kanari. After the First Sino-Japanese War, Bonkichi enlisted in the Imperial Japanese Army. His exceptional leadership and outstanding training skills allowed him to quickly climb the ranks, eventually earning the title of captain. Bonkichi's mission was clear: to lead 210 men from the city of Aomori to the eastern coast through the Hakkoda Mountains, a distance of about 44 miles. Mid-January was chosen to begin the mission. However, what was surprising was that Major Shin Yamaguchi, the second in command, was more experienced and educated. Major Yamaguchi spoke English and French and had fought in the Sino-Japanese War, making him more qualified for leadership. Despite this, he did not take direct command, leaving the matter in Bonkichi's hands. January 23rd, the group set out under Bonkichi's leadership. The first day seemed relatively simple: a short journey from Aomori to Hot Springs, 11 miles away. Bonkichi thought the only difficult part, if any, would be climbing a 2,400-foot mountain along the way. In reality, they didn't face much trouble until they reached the snow in a high pass. Once they set off, problems began to appear quickly. Despite being stationed in the north, not all the soldiers were familiar with the snow or mountainous terrain. In fact, some of them had never seen snow before, which concerned Bonkichi. Bonkichi suggested hiring a local guide who knew the area well, but Major Yamaguchi rejected the idea. He was completely confident in his skills of reading maps and using a compass. But as they progressed, things became more difficult. Specifically, by 10 a.m., the temperature dropped sharply and the snow became unexpectedly deeper. Within just half a mile, the roads turned into a nightmare. The thick snow made movement slower, and the soldiers had no idea they were heading into hell. By the time 11 a.m., as the soldiers continued to carve their way through the harsh terrain, it became evident that moving heavy equipment through the deep snow was an overwhelming challenge. All the essential supplies, food, cooking equipment, heating tools, and shelter building materials were loaded onto a single sled. The soldiers took turns pulling this heavy sled through the increasingly deep snow, but the task became more difficult with every passing moment. The thick snow caused the sled to sink deeper, and the equipment itself started to freeze, adding extra weight and resistance. At this point, Captain Bonkichi began considering the idea of turning back to Aomori, but quickly realized that their mission was not just to test how hard the journey was. It was about determining whether they could accomplish the task at all. This would be the exact scenario they would face if war broke out with Russia, so turning back wasn't an option. Some soldiers protested, but Bonkichi ordered everyone to press on. By late afternoon, the troops had barely advanced a mile. Although the hot springs, their final destination, were less than 3 miles away, The next obstacle was climbing a volcano covered in deep snow. The ascent was a massive challenge, even for the soldiers carrying only their personal gear. For the sled team, it became nearly impossible. The sled team had fallen over an hour behind the main group. Bonkichi gave orders to send additional squads to help pull the sled, while dispatching 15 soldiers ahead to scout the route to the hot springs and assess whether further progress could be made. By evening, the situation reached a critical point. Bonkichi realized that the sled had become an insurmountable burden. All the food had frozen, making it inedible, and the soldiers were exhausted and starving. At this juncture, Bonkichi made a bold decision: to unload the sled. All the equipment was removed, and Bonkichi ordered the soldiers to carry as much of it as they could on their backs. Despite the heavy weight of items like copper cooking pots, there was no other choice. 2 hours after leaving the sled behind, the soldiers resumed their descent from the mountain. Exhaustion was evident on everyone's face, but the decision to lighten the load gave them a fighting chance to survive and continue toward their goal. 11:30 p.m., the soldiers found themselves in a dense forest just a mile away from the hot springs. Not long before, they had encountered the advance group that Bonkichi had sent ahead to scout the route. Unfortunately, the advance group had lost their way in the complex terrain and had inadvertently ended up back where they started, meeting the rest of the force. At this moment, a fierce snowstorm hit them, accompanied by strong winds that whipped the snow into the air, creating a whiteout that made visibility almost impossible. The soldiers could barely see their hands in front of their faces, let alone any landmarks that might guide them toward the hot springs. By the next midnight, Bonkichi realized that pressing forward could lead them to the same fate as the advance group, or worse. Therefore, he decided to order his men to dig a trench in the snow and rest for whatever small amount of comfort they could find. The night was unbearably cold, with temperatures well below freezing. Some soldiers tried to light small fires using the leftover charcoal they managed to salvage from the sled, but it was not enough to warm 210 men. They could barely endure for a few hours, but the situation rapidly deteriorated. Bonkichi knew that if his men stayed where they were, they wouldn't survive the harsh night. With no landmarks or clear map, he had no choice but to rely on the paths they had taken the day before to return to Aomori. The soldiers began their journey back in the midst of the relentless snowstorm. However, the storm had erased all traces of their previous path, making it impossible to find their way. Instead of retracing their steps, they found themselves trapped in a narrow gorge surrounded by steep slopes on both sides. The gorge was blocked and offered no clear path forward. Bonkichi and his men decided to climb the slopes, the only option left, despite the immense risks. The darkness, thick snow, and raging storm made the climb even more dangerous. During the ascent, the soldiers began to hear the screams of their comrades who had lost their balance and fallen to the bottom of the gorge. The impenetrable darkness and zero visibility made it impossible to offer any help. Any soldier who fell would remain alone, lost to the harsh elements. The survivors had no choice but to continue cautiously. A wrong step could be their last. They relied on climbing together, holding onto the edges as much as possible, advancing slowly. In these moments, the terrain was treacherous and the weather bitterly cold. Fear and trembling gripped the soldiers. Bonkichi kept urging his men forward, determined to get them out of this living nightmare. The next morning, as the soldiers continued to climb the slopes, Major Yamamoto ordered everyone to stop suddenly. At that moment, a new command came from First Sergeant Sato, who convinced Major Yamamoto that he knew the way to the hot springs. Within minutes, the decision was made. Sergeant Sato was temporarily given command to guide them to their destination. As time passed, it became clear that Sergeant Sato was completely wrong. He led them off the correct path, and they ended up at the banks of a deep river in an unknown area. With each step, the soldiers felt further away from their goal. The long distance they had covered now seemed to lead to nothing. The soldiers erupted in protest against Sergeant Sato. In a moment of chaos and confusion, one officer, along with another soldier, decided to attempt crossing the river. They were immediately swept away by the strong currents, causing shock among the remaining soldiers. With 2 more men lost to the river, morale completely collapsed. The hope that Sergeant Sato had brought became nothing but an illusion. Bonkichi tried to calm the situation, but he felt powerless. He knew that the only option left now was to retreat once more and return to the perilous slopes where they had lost so many men before. Slowly, he led them back to the place where they had started. After a grueling 2-hour journey, Bonkichi found a temporary resting place, a slight depression on the mountainside that offered some shelter from the fierce winds. However, the winds were so strong that the shelter was rendered useless, and the suffering continued until the dreaded night arrived. This night recorded the coldest temperatures ever seen in Japan's history. The temperature dropped to -41 degrees Celsius, and without proper shelter, many soldiers froze to death. Bonkichi did everything he could to keep his men alive, but after hours of struggle, he discovered that 40 soldiers had lost their lives due to the cold or falling from the slopes. The next day, Bonkichi and the remaining soldiers began their desperate attempt to return to the mountain. At that moment, every man was suffering from some degree of frostbite, while many were in the early stages of hypothermia. They continued their march in the darkness, their hearts filled with dread of death. When Bonkichi woke the remaining soldiers, he noticed that the bodies had completely frozen overnight, filling the area. It was a haunting sight. The sky was unusually dark, and the air was still freezing cold, with every breath that left their mouths instantly turning into frozen vapor. As time passed, the soldiers began to slowly move across the slopes, trying to find a path that might save them. There was no place for rest or safety. The men were exhausted, but they had no choice but to press forward. Bonkichi led them resolutely, knowing that if they stopped now, the journey would end, and that would be their final destination. However, as Bonkichi checked on the military leaders and the remaining men, he felt the weight of responsibility. They had lost so many, and many were in extremely poor condition, their bodies blackened and charred by frostbite. The task had become a nightmare for him. 1 p.m, the sky was overcast, and the surroundings consisted of endless mountains with fog blocking the horizon. The further they advanced, the fog thickened. They had neither enough food nor water, and the frostbite wounds were getting worse. Some soldiers who had been walking beside them began to fall one by one. It was a horrific scene. The soldiers were delirious, sometimes screaming in agony from the cold or pain, while others staggered like ghosts, unable to continue. So, the group began to climb one of the slopes in an attempt to reach a higher point, hoping they might spot the way or find shelter nearby. But the slope was steep, and the ground was slippery due to the snow and ice. With every step, the soldiers grew more exhausted, some crawling more than walking. They reached the top of the slope, but what they saw made them cry until the tears froze on their yellowed faces. They were surrounded by an endless foggy horizon with no sign of the correct path. Bonkichi realized that they wouldn't survive this place. Their map was completely lost, their compass was frozen, and they had no idea where they were. At that moment, Captain Koreishi decided to pause for a moment to gather his thoughts. He looked at the soldiers who were still alive, and then quietly ordered them to continue walking in the direction they felt might lead them to safety, but they must be cautious. They could not afford any more losses. At this moment, he and Major Yamauchi were the last officers still capable of leading. With the soldiers' condition deteriorating rapidly, Bonkichi knew they had to move quickly before time ran out. When Major Yamauchi awoke, his body was groaning with pain, and the heat they were suffering from seemed to grow harsher with each passing moment. Despite his deteriorating health, they decided to press on. Their only option was to keep moving towards the mountains, hoping to find help or shelter. Finally, after hours of suffering, the horizon began to open before them. There were mountain peaks in the distance, and they began to realize they were nearing the place they had been aiming for. This was the only positive thing from the start of their journey. However, despite their proximity to the mountains, their options were limited. They were exhausted beyond measure, and there were not many supplies left. By now, hunger and cold had etched themselves into their faces horribly. At the same time, Captain Koreyashi stayed behind to keep the other soldiers on track, but the soldiers' weakness was evident. Everyone was so worn out that they couldn't even stand on their feet for long periods. That night, they gathered together in a small circle, trying to make use of whatever heat was left in their bodies. But the next morning, the situation worsened. They woke up to find that a large group had frozen to death, leaving only 30 soldiers alive. Bonkichi gathered them and set off early in the morning, looking for a way out of the disaster. Finally, they reached the crossroads, unsure which direction would lead them to safety. The decision was made to split into two groups. Captain Bonkichi led the majority of the soldiers in one direction, while Captain Koreyashi decided to lead part of the troops in another direction. Unfortunately, this was the wrong choice, as Koreyashi's group ended up on the wrong path and eventually reached a river where two soldiers were swept away when they tried to cross. To make matters worse, the blizzard was intensifying, making things even worse. For many, this was the end. Several of them collapsed in the snow and couldn't get back up again. When they realized they were on the wrong path near the river, Captain Koreyashi decided the best option was to stop and wait for the rescue team. However, not everyone agreed with this decision. Some soldiers, frustrated by the long wait, decided to try crossing the river in hopes of reaching safety, but all of them failed. Even Sergeant Sato, who was sure he knew the way, failed to cross the river as he fought. Meanwhile, Bonkichi's other group was heading in the right direction, but they were no better off. With each step, another soldier collapsed in the snow and couldn't get up again until the entire group froze to death. Only two remained, Bonkichi himself and another officer, Corporal Goto. In the end, they thought they could see a city in the distance, and they were right. It was Tamagino, on the outskirts of Aomori. Completely exhausted, Bonkichi took one last look at the lights ahead and collapsed onto the ground. He then looked at the corporal and gave the final order, saying, "Go to Tamagino and ask the locals to contact the battalion." These were his last words. A few hours later, the rescue team found the corporal standing motionless in the snow. He had been walking for hours, and by that time, his energy had completely drained. When they found him, he was still alive, but he was frozen in place. The rescue team described him as resembling a statue emerging from the snow. When they finally found the corporal, here, the command began to worry about the 5th Battalion after they failed to appear on the 4th of January as scheduled. They were delayed by just one day, raising doubts about their situation, as the weather the previous day had been very bad, and after 2 days of delay, when the 25th January came and there was still no sign of the soldiers, everyone began to feel the real danger. Food was prepared, hoping they had been delayed due to the weather conditions, but by 10 p.m, no one had appeared. The local police were contacted in an attempt to find any trace of them. Official start of the rescue mission. On the 3rd day of delay, the official rescue mission began. More than 10,000 people participated, including the rest of the Aomori Battalion and the Hirosaki Battalion. The first step was to try to determine the path that might lead Bonkichi's forces to their destination. As the rescue teams moved through the snow, they used long sticks to probe the ground. If they felt anything strange under the snow, they would stop and dig to make sure there was a soldier buried. The digging operations lasted 6 hours a day, and they used every imaginable method to reach the missing soldiers. Trained dogs provided by a local tribe were also used. Although the dogs managed to find several soldiers, all of them were dead. The rescue team soon discovered that many of the bodies had been carried away by currents into the rivers, so they began building sand barriers to prevent the bodies from being swept away further. After 2 days of searching, on February 1st, Captain Koreyashi was found in a cave on the cliff where the survivors from his group had taken shelter from the blizzards. Major Yamauchi was also rescued, but unfortunately, he died on the 2nd of February while receiving treatment in the hospital. He died from a heart attack, though some believe the shame from the disaster was too much for him to bear. The next day, the body of Captain Bonkichi Kanari was found miles away from the location where he had collapsed and frozen to death. 2 days later, on the 3rd of February, 36 more bodies were found along the road near the crossroads where the two commanders had been found. The grief had reached its peak. But on January 1st, a miracle happened. 2 more soldiers were found alive in a coal mine hut. They were taken to the hospital, but only one survived to tell the story. There were also 16 other soldiers around the hut, all frozen to death. Not far from this hut, in the surrounding forest, many other bodies were found, buried by the frozen snow. The end was painful, as only 11 people survived out of the 210 soldiers who set out on the mission. For those who survived, their lives were filled with pain. 8 of them had to amputate their limbs due to deadly frostbite, while another lost 3 fingers. The disaster was too great for everyone to survive, and it claimed most of their lives. After the tragedy, investigations were conducted to determine the causes of the disaster. The harsh weather was the first reason identified. On January 5th of that year, the lowest recorded temperature in Japan's history was recorded. In addition, the poor clothing they wore was not suited for such conditions. At the time, the uniform consisted of a woolen coat, a service cap, a cotton flannel uniform, cotton gloves, and long snow boots, but only if you were an officer. Non-officer soldiers lacked this proper gear. However, some officers had purchased better clothing before the mission, and they were among the survivors. For example, Captain Koreyashi had bought a pair of rubber boots in Tokyo earlier in the year, which is believed to have helped him survive frostbite, as his feet were saved thanks to this smart decision. In addition to the clothing, there was a major failure in leadership. Although Bonkichi was supposed to lead the campaign, the second lieutenant, who outranked him, did not always follow his orders. In many situations, Bonkichi's decisions were questioned. For example, when Major Yamauchi decided to listen to Sergeant Sato and take a route they had already passed before, this mistake wasted time and drained their energy. In the end, it was the severe weather, poor planning, and weak leadership that led to one of the worst mountain disasters in history. Today, near the site of the tragedy, there is a memorial statue of Corporal Goto, standing still, alone, waiting for the rescue that never came, a statue that tells many heart-touching stories. And on February 6th, 1904, Russia and Japan entered the war. Japan won, but this did not make them forget the Hakkoda Mountains disaster.